I remember the dog barking first. It was late afternoon, the kind of gray winter light that flattens everything into the same color. I had taken the old trail behind the property because the dog refused to settle. He kept pacing, whining toward the woods. At the time, I thought it was a deer. Now I replay every minute of that walk like a slow recording, trying to find the moment when the world tilted, and I just didn't recognize it yet. The woods behind our town aren't deep, not really. You can hear cars from the highway if the wind is right. But there are pockets where the trees lean close together and the ground dips into shadows that swallow sound. The dog ran ahead. Then he stopped. No barking. Just standing there. That was the first wrong thing. I walked toward him, pushing branches aside, and saw something pale on the ground between the trees. For a second my brain refused to name it. It was my daughter. She was curled on her side like she had fallen asleep in the dirt. Her coat was gone. Her sweater was torn at the shoulder. Her hair was matted with mud and leaves. Her skin had that gray, drained color people get when their bodies are running out of heat. I dropped to my knees. Her breathing was shallow. Too slow. "Hey," I said, but the word came out rough, like it belonged to someone else. Her eyelids fluttered. It took effort for her to focus on me. "Dad." The relief was so sudden it hurt. My chest felt like it collapsed and inflated at the same time. I wrapped my jacket around her and pulled her against me. "What happened?" For a moment she didn't answer. Her lips trembled, like the question itself was heavy. Then she leaned close to my ear. "It was my mother-in-law," she whispered. The words barely existed. She said my blood was dirty. I didn't react the way people imagine. There was no shouting. No rush of anger. No cinematic moment where the sky turns black and vengeance becomes the only language left. Instead, something colder moved through me. A quiet calculation. I carried her to the truck. The drive home felt like traveling through fog. Every movement was deliberate, heater on, hazard lights flashing, one hand steady on the wheel, while the other checked her pulse every few minutes. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Once she murmured something about the river path near the old logging road. Another time she whispered a name, and then shook her head as if correcting herself. Mostly there was silence. At the house I got her inside, wrapped her in blankets and called emergency services. The operator asked the usual questions. Age, location, condition. I answered automatically. While we waited for the ambulance, I sat beside her on the floor. Her hand was small inside mine. The strange thing about anger is how patient it can be when it's real. It doesn't scream. It watches. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out and opened a new message. My brother's name sat at the top of the screen. We hadn't spoken much about our childhood in years. Some memories are like rusted tools, you know they're there, but you leave them alone. Still, our grandfather had made sure certain lessons never disappeared. Not about fighting. About restraint. About timing. About what to do when someone believed cruelty was their birthright. I typey. It's our turn. Time for what Grandpa taught us. He responded almost immediately. I'm coming. The ambulance arrived with lights reflecting off the trees outside the window. The paramedics moved with calm efficiency, blankets, oxygen, quiet voices. They asked her questions gently. Documented everything. One of them glanced at me when he saw the marks on her wrists. Do you know what happened?
Yes,
I said. But I didn't explain yet. Hospitals have a way of slowing everything down. Tests, observations, paperwork. My daughter slept for hours while doctors stabilized her temperature and treated dehydration. When she woke again, a nurse sat beside her with a tablet, recording answers carefully. No one rushed her. No one suggested alternative explanations. That was the moment I realized something important. This was no longer a private conflict. The story had moved into a place where records existed. Witnesses. Institutions. My brother arrived near midnight. He looked older than I remembered. When he saw my daughter through the hospital room window, something in his posture shifted, like a man rediscovering a language he once spoke fluently. We sat in the hallway for a long time without talking. Finally he said, "She told you, Wes." He nodded slowly. Our grandfather had believed something very specific. Cruelty grows best in silence. Families often protect it by pretending certain things are tradition, honor, purity, obedience. Words that hide violence in plain sight. When we were teenagers, Grandpa used to say one thing over and over. Stopping harm is not the same as avenging it. At the time I didn't understand why he made that distinction so carefully. Now I did. The following morning 2 investigators arrived. They were polite but direct. One spoke to me while the other sat with my daughter. They asked about the Woods, about her marriage, about her mother-in-law. I watched through the glass as my daughter spoke quietly. Sometimes she paused for long stretches, sometimes she stared at her hands. But she didn't change her story. The accusation about her blood, the isolation, the argument that escalated, the drive to the woods. The moment she realized she had been left there. When the investigators finished, they thanked her. Not in the casual way people say thank you. In the careful way people use when they know someone has done something difficult. By afternoon, medical documentation had been added to the file. Photographs, notes, statements. The story that had once been whispered inside a family was now written in official language. My brother stood beside me in the hallway when the call came confirming that officers had located the mother-in-law. There was no dramatic reveal, just procedure questions, transportation, and the quiet understanding that certain explanations would now have to exist in front of people who were not bound by family loyalty. Power can disappear very quickly once it leaves the privacy of a living room. Over the next week the situation unfolded the way these things do, slowly, methodically. Lawyers appeared. Statements were clarified. People who had once stayed silent began speaking. Neighbors, relatives. Even someone from the church group mentioned earlier incidents that had always been brushed aside. My daughter remained at the hospital for observation longer than expected. When she was finally released, she came home with me. The first morning back she stood in the kitchen doorway holding a mug of tea. Sunlight touched the counter in that quiet way it does during winter, somehow. But steadier. "I thought you'd be angry," she said. "I was," I answered. Maybe." She waited. "What changed?" she asked. I thought about that for a moment. "Anger can repeat the same story," I said. "Or it can end it." She nodded slowly, like she was turning the sentence over in her mind. Across the room my brother leaned against the window, watching the yard. The woods were visible in the distance beyond the fence line. They looked ordinary again. Trees, wind, nothing remarkable. But I knew the place would never feel neutral to me. Some landscapes become permanent reminders. That afternoon my daughter stepped outside for the first time since coming home. She walked only as far as the mailbox. Then she stood there for a long moment, breathing the cold air. I watched from the porch. There was no celebration, no feeling that justice had balanced everything. Lives had shifted in ways that would never fully return to their original shape. But one thing was clear. The pattern that had traveled quietly through generations, the belief that cruelty could hide behind family authority, had finally been dragged into the open. And once something like that becomes visible, it rarely fits back into silence again.